Hello and welcome to the Stanford Center on Longevity series webinar, The Longevity Perspective with Professor Laura Carstensen. Thank you so much everybody for joining us. I am Sasha Johnson-Fried and I will be our host for today. I'm a researcher here at the center. I want to start by thanking some of the people and organizations that have made this possible, including those listed here. And before we do get to the presentation, a quick housekeeping note. Throughout the presentation, we encourage you to post questions for our speaker. And at the end of the webinar, I will ask Professor Carstensen some of the questions that you post. So during the webinar, to ask a question, you can just type it into the question section of the GoToWebinar sidebar window on your computer. And with that, I would like to introduce our speaker. Professor Carstensen is a professor of psychology and public policy at Stanford University and the founding director of the Stanford Center on Longevity. And she's really the world expert on longevity and the psychology of living long and healthy lives. Today she will be sharing research on the increasing ubiquity of long lives, as well as some of the opportunities and challenges associated with this unprecedented demographic shift. So Professor Carstensen, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Sasha. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. My plan is to paint a very broad overview of long life in the 21st century. Life has changed dramatically. We are on the cusp of a new era where people are living longer than our great-grandparents ever would have dreamed. In the 20th century, life expectancy nearly doubled in industrialized developed nations. I know these statistics are familiar to many of you, but make no mistake, this is a change unprecedented in the history of humankind. Adults today can expect to live much longer than their parents and their grandparents lived. And your children and grandchildren? Well, one prominent demographer recently estimated that half of the babies born in the developed world since the year 2000 will reach 100 and beyond. Again, to put this in historical perspective helps us to see just how sudden this change has been. Throughout most of human evolution, life was short. We don't know exactly what life expectancy was in the early years when we were living on the African plains, but the estimates range from 18 to 20. Life expectancy increased over thousands of years. Evolution acted on the length of lives people lived. It acted in the way that evolution acts at a snail-like pace. And life expectancy inched up a little bit, and a little bit, and a little bit. You see here depicted on this image how life expectancy rose from the early Iron and Bronze Age of 18 up to the mid-30s and reaching the 40s, just nearing the 40s in the 1800s. By 1900, life expectancy in the United States was 47. And then by the end of that same century, life expectancy was 77. Today, it's 79. And that change is not finished with us yet. In recent years, 3 months has been added to average life expectancy at 65 every year. And we continue to see these changes projected throughout the 20th century. These changes are really stunning. Because the number of children, that is the fertility rates, fell across the very same years that life expectancy was going up, we created aging societies. In 1900 in the United States, 4% of the population was over the age of 65. Today, that number is 14%, and it will increase to 20% by 2030. It was the combination of these two phenomena, fewer children born and life expectancy going up across the same years, that produced aging societies. By the way, compared to other countries in the developed world, the United States is the young kid on the block. In Japan and parts of Europe, the proportional change will be even greater. In 2015, 26% of the Japanese population was over 65. And estimates are that that percentage may reach somewhere between 36% to 41%, depending on fertility, by 2050. How long can we live? Well, the answer to this question is not known, and it is a topic of considerable debate. Ever since humans realized our own mortality, we've been searching for a way to find the fountain of youth. We used to sail off in ships, and today we turn to laboratories. But scientists today are continuing to see if there may be advances in the laboratory that could significantly increase lifespan. Now, there's a distinction here between life expectancy and lifespan. Life expectancy simply refers to the average number of years a given population lives. Lifespan refers to the capacity of an organism, a species, to live for a particular length of time. We don't know what lifespan is in humans. We know what it is in fruit flies, Drosophila. We know what it is in earthworms, but we don't know how long humans could live. There are those who say that advances in the 21st century may actually alter the span of time that humans can potentially live. But it's important also to note that if we were to increase lifespan, that would remain something that's a promise of the 21st century, but an increase in lifespan has nothing to do with the changes that we're living through today. The changes that we're living through reflect life expectancy, the average length of life. And there is no reason to think that we are different genetically from our ancestors 10,000 years ago. It's not that we're evolving and getting hardier and hardier. Rather, the odds of making it to old age have increased. The story of how we as a society somehow launched ourselves into this era of very long life doesn't really begin with a discussion about older people. It begins with a story about babies. The dramatic increase in life expectancy, this average, came about largely because fewer of the youngsters died. In 1900, 25% of babies who were born in the United States died before they reached 5. Many more died before they reached 12. And death was common at all ages. Maternal mortality was very high. In fact, death wasn't particularly strongly associated with old age. People died quickly from contagious diseases, and life expectancy varied tremendously as a matter of luck and chance. What our ancestors did in the 20th century was to begin to build a world to protect the young. We discovered the causes of diseases and the ways that they spread. We developed widespread public health programs and vaccinated people against diseases they would never have to suffer. We pasteurized milk, we purified waterways, and we implemented the systematic collection of waste, that is, garbage collection. And there are historians today who write that you can thank them as much as your physicians for reducing the spread of disease. We didn't stop there. We also discovered the nutritional needs of young children, and in a matter of decades, we built food fortification programs in the United States and Europe that built vitamins into the food supply that virtually eliminated nutritional disorders like rickets and pellagra, gout. We didn't stop there. We passed child labor laws, and we established public education in every state in this great nation so that all children, not just the privileged few, could learn how to read and write. Today, at some point in adulthood, education is a better predictor of life expectancy than age. And so this population pyramid that you see in the image before you, this pyramid that represented the distribution of age in the population in the United States and in every country around the globe, that pyramid is being reshaped into a rectangle. And what this means is that for the first time in human history, babies who are born can anticipate not only reaching old age, but living in old age for decades. Because of these efforts of our ancestors to protect and foster the lives of young children, we are now standing at a point in history where for the first time, 4 and 5 generations will routinely be alive at the same time. Now, our ancestors weren't trying to create aging societies. They were trying to protect the young children, but they were so successful that those young children did survive to adulthood and are growing old today. Now, you might think that people would be rejoicing. We have more time to chase our dreams, to spend with our loved ones, to pursue our goals. You might think people would be out dancing in the streets, celebrating this great gift of life. But that's really not been the response that individuals and policymakers, leaders, have had to this increase in life expectancy. Why? Well, I don't have a lot of time with you today, so I thought I would put the entire literature on aging together in a single slide. What you see on the y-axis here is any variable you like, physical functioning, you could put in societal status, cognitive abilities, and on the x-axis at the bottom, what you see is chronological age. And mostly when people think about aging, they think about this kind of declining trajectory. That is, the older people get, the poorer their status is. And that's why there's a lot of hand-wringing by policymakers and individuals about this new world that we created that is including millions more older people than we've ever had in the past. I'd like to tell you that there's no truth to this declining trajectory, and I can't do that. There are many problems we do need to wrestle with related to aging, physical aging, psychological aging, social aging. But the more we learn about aging, the more nuanced the story becomes. It's clear that a steady downward trajectory doesn't characterize aging. And in fact, there's even some good news. So let me walk you through some of the findings. In this next slide, you see the mortality risk for men across historical time. This is an analysis that was conducted by my colleague John Chauvin here at Stanford. He is an economist who studies mortality risk, and he has maintained that we're measuring age the wrong way by measuring it as the number of years since you were born. Instead, another way to look at age would be how much time you have left. And what Chauvin finds out is that it looks like we've pushed disability off farther into the future as we come to live longer lives. What you see in this image is the age across historical time that men reached mortality risks of 1%, 2%, and 4%. That is, you would have a 1% chance of dying in the following year, 2% or 4. Professor Chauvin argues that when you have a 2% chance of dying in the following year, we'll call you old. Now, take a look at this chart. What you see is that in 1970s, or toward the end of the 1970s, for men, they reached that mortality risk at 59. But if you go out to 2020, you see that people aren't reaching that age until about 68. So what we're seeing is that 68 is the new 59. Now, we see the same pattern for women, only women live longer, so we're seeing that disability, or that age where we reach this 2% mortality risk, being pushed out even farther into the future. The point is that people aren't reaching times of significant disability until more advanced ages. In the next figure that you see here, you see results from a survey that asked people aged 55 to over 85 whether they were in good enough functional health that they had no real limitations. They were healthy enough to work either at home or in the paid workforce. Now, what you see here is that those 55 to 59, the vast majority of them are saying that they are in good enough health to work. And then follow this out to the bar here where we see people 85 and older. What's noticeable here are two things. One is you see many fewer people who report being healthy enough to work, but you see roughly 50% of people over 85 saying they're healthy enough to work, that they don't really have any functional limitations. This is pretty striking and suggests again that we have a different population of older people today than we had in earlier historical times. It also points to increasing variability in aging outcomes. So we can say about half of people over 85 don't have any real significant functional limitations, another half do. So we see increasing variability in outcomes the older people get. We know something about what predicts that variability, and there may be no predictor better than education. What you see in this image is a chart showing again the proportion of people who have no functional limitations by age, but we've broken this down by level of education. What you see in the green line are people who didn't finish high school. In the blue line, people who had a little bit of college, and in the red line, people who completed 4 years post-high school college, 4 years or more. Now, what you see at the very young age, at 30, is that most people, regardless of level of education, are functioning very well in terms of health. And at the very end, go all the way to 85 and look at those lines. They're again beginning to converge. Nearly everyone gets sick for some period of time before they die. But look in the middle of life. Here you see widespread variability, wide ranges, and functional health mapped very neatly onto levels of education. People who have completed college, even in the mid-70s, are likely to be functioning very well. 79% of people at 75, according to this study, are living completely on their own, functioning very well. Whereas those percentages are much lower in people who had low levels of education. Now, there are two messages we should take from this kind of an analysis. One is that variability speaks against inevitability. If people with high levels of education age very, very well in terms of functional health, it means it's not age per se that is doing them in. On the other hand, most people in the United States and in the developed world don't have high levels of education. So we have a lot of work to do to create a world where the majority of people arrive at old age physically fit, functionally able, financially secure. So let's look at cognitive processing. We hear a lot about cognitive decline with age. It's important to understand what declines and what doesn't. The decline that we see that's well documented is a decline in processing speed. That's how quickly, how fast people can learn brand new information under speeded conditions. That is, you have to solve a problem, understand something completely novel, and then act on that information. And we see declines in processing speed beginning in the 20s. The specific age is 23. We begin to see a kind of a downward trajectory in the speed of new learning. We hear a lot about this, both by employers and from individuals, and there's great concern about a decline in cognitive processing. What we hear much less about is that across the very same years that we're seeing a decline in processing speed, knowledge is going up. That is, the amount of information that people know. So people may learn a little bit slower than they used to, but they have more years to have collected information. So we see the funds of information continue to grow throughout adulthood. There's some good news about dementia and aging. We don't fully understand why, but we've been seeing the rates of dementia drop in older parts of the population now for many years. This was initially observed in the 1970s, and a recent report has shown that between 2000 and 2011, the rates of dementia in older adults dropped by 24%. We need to understand why this is happening. Most social scientists would bet on education, that we're seeing some protective effects of education, and also that people are being treated for chronic diseases. So even though we're developing more chronic diseases like diabetes and high blood pressure, science, medical science is providing new treatments that appear to help block the disabilities that have long been associated with those conditions. So this is terrific news. We've also come to see in a lot of research now that older people are doing better emotionally than younger people and their middle-aged counterparts. And if this is a surprise to you, you're certainly not alone. It makes headlines. People have been very surprised to find that older people experience better emotional balance in their day-to-day lives, and also that they're less likely to experience any of the psychiatric disorders, with the exception of the dementias, which is clearly organically based. And we see lower rates of depression, of anxiety, of psychotic disorders in older adults than we see, again, in the young. This is a really important finding because the only natural resource in the world that's actually growing is older people. And what we see in this population is a group of people who are functionally healthier than ever before in history, who are knowledgeable and emotionally stable. And this is something we really need to begin to give serious thought to. How do we tap this growing resource? Again, this is a group of participants who are really zeroing in on the real challenges that older people face, but also on new potentials. The majority of you are saying that you're most optimistic about the opportunity to have new life course plans, and I will return to this at the end of our session. We really have an extraordinary opportunity before us. Longer lives are going to allow us to not only live longer, but to live differently. And the positive impact on families is also something that we can expect to see. With emotionally stable, knowledgeable individuals as family members, we may see family life also improve. Of course, it's hardly time to rest on our laurels. Improved longevity is at once among the most remarkable achievements in all of human history and one of our greatest challenges. There are now a raft of new diseases that were never really problems for society before, and now we need to find ways to treat and cure them, like Alzheimer's disease, osteoarthritis, osteoporosis, stroke, heart disease, cancers are all increasing in rates in older populations. We need to now harness the opportunities and the really breathtaking capacity of science and technology to address the kinds of challenges that we see in older populations so that we can begin to improve health in the second half of life to the degree that we saw it improved by our ancestors in the last century for the first half of life. And the good news here is that biological, social science, and technological advances really are beginning to address many of the challenges older people face. Aging is a risk factor for most diseases. For cardiovascular disease, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, most diseases actually have greater risk the older people get. And so what biological scientists are now beginning to address are those fundamental changes in our biology that place us at risk. Now, to the extent that science could identify a way, a treatment to keep those changes at a minimum, we could reduce all of these diseases with the same kind of intervention. And there are brilliant scientists today, Tom Rando, the Deputy Director of the Center on Longevity, among them, who are focused on trying to change this basic biology associated with aging. And of course, it isn't only biological science. We are seeing incredible advances in technology. A company called My Lively that was developed by Iggy Fanlow and David Glickman is a system based on sensors placed in a home that can alert caring family members or social services to changes in an individual's patterns and safety with a very minimal level of invasive technology. That is, simply by putting a sensor on a refrigerator or on a bathroom door, on a chair that a person uses often, one can see if the patterns that person has developed are different on one day from another and intervene accordingly. Another colleague of mine here at Stanford in biomechanical engineering, a man named Tom Andriaki, has developed a variable stiffness sole that is now available for purchase, and it reduces the pain of osteoarthritis by shifting gait ever so slightly. And it also appears to limit the course of the disease, the worsening of the disease over time. So wearable technologies are also beginning to develop that may help us treat and prevent disease. And there are some very cutting-edge technologies that are beginning to appear in laboratories and aren't quite ready for the market yet. But there's something called bioskin. It is an extremely thin polymer that is stretchable and can be placed on the body much like a tattoo would be placed, and measure in day-to-day life levels of glucose, hydration, cardiac output, respiration, communicate those indices wirelessly, integrate them, and give a user feedback via a handheld device about their health, basically in real time. These kinds of advances may be able to tell us that we're going to get sick long before we see any symptoms. This could really help improve health. And of course, social science is absolutely as important as the biomedical and technology areas. We need to change the way we live. As we live longer, we need to live healthier, and that means we need to begin to make different kinds of decisions. And we need to look forward to longer and longer futures where those decisions will have cumulative impacts on our lives. We need to better understand nutrition, not only how nutrition affects our weight and our biological functioning, but also how the foods we eat can affect our cognitive abilities and function. Increasingly, we begin to see evidence that eating a particular kind of a diet may keep us healthier and more cognitively fit than another. We need to better understand exercise. Today, exercise is the very best strategy a person can adopt if you want to live a long and healthy life, both mentally in terms of emotion, cognitively in terms of speed of processing, and physically. And we need to understand better how we live and what types of exercise we need to do at different ages. It's adolescence where we need to begin to help people lay down bone so that as they live to very advanced ages, they're better protected against diseases like osteoporosis, for example. We know that exercise has powerful effects and positive effects. We need to understand how those effects come about and how we need to live our lives differently in order to reap the benefits. And we are learning that engaging in the world, offering one's services to other people as a volunteer, seem to confer positive effects on physical health. So we've been trying to recruit older people into volunteer roles to help the targets of those opportunities. We're beginning to see in recent years evidence accumulating that it may also have a positive effect on physical health and cognition. Of course, we see similar kinds of effects on paid work. So being engaged in either paid or unpaid work may help us physically. Realizing this speaks against retirements that are now beginning to last longer than life expectancy itself was early in human evolution. If retirement's going to last 20 years and we're not going to be engaged in the world, either productively for financial reasons or in order to offer benefits to others and reap the benefits of giving, that we need to really begin to worry. We need to think about new ways of living throughout our lives and working. The good news is that people are beginning to work longer. We're beginning to see these changes in both men and women where people are working longer. And surveys of baby boomers who are still in the workforce suggest that baby boomers will be working longer as they reach 65 and older. To conclude, we have before us an incredible opportunity, not just to live longer, but to live differently. What you see in this image is the parsing of education and work and leisure that is encouraged by social norms today. We get all our education early, we work like dogs in the middle of life, working very hard in the workplace, but also raising families and offering care to older relatives. And then, bingo, we hit 65 and we say, okay, now we can get a little bit of leisure. We can now begin to reshape the normative life course in ways that will improve quality throughout. We could stretch out education all the way through, for example, where universities come to have revolving doors where people come in and out of the workforce over time. We can work less at different times in life, for example, when we're parents raising young children, but continue to work throughout our lives, just at different amounts, coming in and out and working flexibly. Part-time work will come to be something much more normative. It can really improve quality of life for younger and middle-aged people. And if we change education and work, we may just be able to get a little bit of leisure before retirement, which would also improve quality of life. So what can you do? Probably the most important first step is to begin to anticipate your 80s and 90s so that you plan ways to live and enjoy life, to be functionally secure, financially secure, physically healthy, mentally healthy. Begin to realize that you likely have a very long future. And of course, keep in mind that those babies born since 2000 are likely to be centenarians. We need to raise our children, preparing them to be very old and doing very well. Think about ways that you can improve your health now that are sustainable, that are enjoyable, so that you come to have different diets than you may have had in the past, but diets that you enjoy, that involve delicious food and exercises that are fun. Keep in mind that maintaining social ties is as important as other aspects of preparing for long life. Feeling socially isolated in old age is a risk factor for mortality. Maintain your social relationships. Don't let them slack off in the middle of life. And we also know that continuing to learn is really good for the brain. So we should engage in our lives through work, through volunteer activities, so that we continue to learn. Curiosity is a very good predictor of long and healthy life. And as we've reviewed, it appears that being actively engaged in either volunteer work or paid work is something that's important for us, not only financially, but in terms of our well-being. So begin to think about working to some degree for most of your life.
Thank you so much, Professor Carstensen, for that presentation. And to our attendees, this is Sasha again. I'm going to field some questions from the audience for our speaker. And I think we just have time for about one question, but a few attendees are interested, Professor Carstensen, in your own opinions about the two poll questions. So what do you think are the biggest challenges and the biggest opportunities for our society going forward with this unprecedented era of long lives?
Good questions. To me, the basic challenges, the greatest challenges involve physical health and treating and preventing diseases that so negatively affect quality of life at advanced ages. We really need to employ science and technology and focus them on these years like we've never had to in the past. So we need to address disease and functional impairment. We've got a lot of work to do with physical aging. As I mentioned, cognitive aging, emotional aging, that we're doing pretty well. But physical aging and diseases do affect many older people and their families in very negative ways. We need new cures for new diseases that we're wrestling with. The greatest opportunity, in my view, is changing the way we live our lives. The social norms that guide us through life today are norms that evolved around lives half as long. And so the idea that you get all your education early, you work like a dog in the middle of life, and then you retire works for a population that lives on average 50 years. Works for Social Security, it works for Medicare, because we don't have many people reaching those advanced ages. But given the length of the lives that we're living today, we have an opportunity here to make life better throughout. The participants in the workforce who are the least happy are parents with young children, for example. They're the ones who are feeling stressed because they're making choices every day about whether to be a good worker or a good parent. And we don't have to make those choices anymore. In the past, we really did have to make those choices because we didn't have a lot of time to live. We've got more time, and the opportunity is to consider how we want to use those added years and to make those changes early in life.
So, Professor Carstensen, what do you want attendees to take home from this presentation?
I want attendees to begin to think about this unprecedented era in which we're living. Historically, there's never been a time like this before. We need to think about what it'll mean for individual participants. You need to think about your own futures, but also for societies that have been reshaped. So we'll have societies eventually where we have about the same number of young, middle-aged, and old people as they become rectangularized. What does that mean for society, for work, for saving, financial preparedness, physical health? And we need to shift the conversation from one about a crisis on the horizon, and it is a crisis we will face, to be sure, if we do nothing. But we need to shift that conversation from one that is exclusively about the challenge and the crisis to one that also includes the possibility for remarkable new opportunities. And we do need also to understand that the way that we live our lives varies dramatically across socioeconomic strata, across the disadvantaged and the advantaged in society. And to my mind, what we'll do when we revisit these issues in the context of longevity is see that we cannot afford as societies to limit the opportunities that all of our citizens have.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Carstensen, for this fascinating presentation. I certainly learned from it. And to our attendees, we have several upcoming webinars in this series. So next month we have one on life planning in the age of longevity with Tamara Sims. And next we have one on understanding longevity and life expectancies. And finally in June, one on financial fraud. So some of them, I think there'll be some fascinating conversations going on there. So Laura, thank you.
It was a pleasure.
And so thank you to all our attendees for coming, and I hope it's been helpful to you. And this is the end of the webinar.